Sometimes, life doesn't unfold the way you expect. It's not the big decisions that catch you off guard, it's the small ones, the ones you don't even realize you're making until they've changed everything. My name is Cynthia, and this is the story of how I let my choices affect everything I held dear. If my experiences can help someone else avoid the pain I caused, then sharing them is worth it. I'm not proud of what I did, but I've learned that growth starts with honesty. And so, I'm here to tell the truth. Mark and I had been married for 25 years. On the surface, everything seemed fine. We had a home, stability, and a life that most people would envy. But over time, something changed. We stopped connecting the way we used to. I used to think that silence was normal, that it was just part of being married for so long. But the truth is, that silence can grow, and if you're not careful, it can take over. That's what happened to us. We became roommates instead of partners. Then, I met David. He was a coworker, smart, kind, and easy to talk to. At first, it was just small talk during lunch breaks, nothing out of the ordinary. But over time, those conversations started to feel different. David made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. He noticed little things about me, my new haircut, the way I liked my coffee. Those little things started to matter more than they should have. I told myself it was harmless. He was just a friend. But deep down, I knew I was walking a fine line. The attention felt good, and I didn't want it to stop. The first time we met outside of work, it was supposed to be nothing, a quick coffee to talk about work projects. But that coffee turned into a long conversation, and that conversation turned into something I didn't plan for. When he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. When he kissed me, I didn't stop him. In that moment, it felt like all the loneliness I'd been carrying disappeared. But as soon as it ended, the weight of what I'd done hit me like a tidal wave. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to undo it. I convinced myself it was a mistake I wouldn't repeat. But the truth is, once you cross that line, it's hard to go back. I thought I could compartmentalize it, keep it separate from my life with Mark. But the guilt started to consume me. I felt like I was living two lives, and neither of them felt real anymore. That night marked a turning point. I had to make a choice, keep lying or face the truth. I didn't know how Mark would react, but I knew I couldn't keep living this way. It was time to face the consequences of my actions. The days after were some of the hardest of my life. Admitting what I'd done wasn't just about honesty, it was about taking responsibility for the pain I'd caused and figuring out if there was any way to rebuild what I'd broken. After that first time, I told myself I'd stop. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, something I could bury and forget. But the truth is, guilt doesn't just disappear. It lingers, creeping into every part of your life. I started pulling away from Mark. Every time he asked if I was okay, I'd brush it off, saying I was tired or stressed. But inside, I was crumbling. I couldn't look him in the eye without hearing my own lies echoing back at me. Mark isn't the kind of person who pries. He's always trusted me, maybe too much. But one evening, he came home early and saw a message pop up on my phone. I'll never forget the look on his face when he handed me the phone and asked, "Who's David?" I froze. I tried to downplay it, saying David was just a coworker, that it wasn't a big deal. But Mark didn't buy it. He kept pressing, and I could see the doubt growing in his eyes. That's when I knew I couldn't keep lying. I told him the truth. Not all of it, not at once. I started with the messages, then the meetings, and finally, the kiss. Each word felt like a knife, cutting deeper into the life we built together. By the time I finished, Mark was silent. He didn't yell or accuse me. He just sat there, staring at me like I was a stranger. The days after were some of the hardest of my life. Mark barely spoke to me. He moved into the guest room, and the silence in the house was deafening. I knew I had shattered his trust, and I didn't know if I could ever repair it. I wanted to fix things, to show him how sorry I was. But every time I tried to talk, I could see the hurt in his eyes. It was like looking at the aftermath of a storm, knowing you caused the destruction but not knowing how to rebuild. I felt like I'd lost everything: Mark's trust, the foundation of our marriage, and my own sense of who I was. The person I saw in the mirror wasn't someone I recognized anymore. I knew I couldn't fix this on my own. The guilt, the shame, it was too much to carry. So, I reached out to a therapist, someone who could help me make sense of what I'd done and why. Therapy forced me to face hard truths about myself. I had to confront the reasons behind my actions, the loneliness I'd felt, the lack of communication with Mark, and the choices I made to fill that void. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Mark agreed to come to therapy with me, but I could tell he was reluctant. He was hurt, and rightfully so. But he also wanted answers. He wanted to understand how we'd gotten here and whether there was any hope of moving forward. Hearing those words was like a punch to the gut. I knew rebuilding trust wouldn't happen overnight, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I couldn't give up. If there was even a small chance of repairing what I'd broken, I had to try. Therapy was just the beginning. It forced us to confront things we'd avoided for years: our communication, our expectations, and the ways we'd let each other down. It wasn't easy, but it was the only way forward. After Mark agreed to therapy, the first hurdle was learning how to talk to each other again. We had spent years avoiding the hard conversations, and now we had to confront them all at once. It was overwhelming. I remember our therapist asking us what we wanted from our marriage, and I couldn't answer right away. I hadn't thought about what I wanted in years. Mark said he wanted honesty, trust, and to feel like we were a team again. Hearing that broke my heart because I knew how far we were from that. I started keeping a journal during that time, writing down my thoughts and the things I wanted to say but couldn't find the courage to. It helped me understand myself better and gave me a way to start rebuilding the bridge between us. One session, Mark finally let out everything he'd been holding back: the anger, the betrayal, the sadness. He told me he felt like he didn't know who I was anymore, that I'd destroyed the foundation of everything we'd built. Hearing that was devastating, but I knew he needed to say it. I didn't try to defend myself or make excuses. I just listened because I knew he needed to be heard. It was one of the hardest moments of my life, but it was also a turning point. For the first time, we were being honest with each other about how we felt. That session taught me that healing isn't just about saying sorry. It's about facing the pain you've caused and being willing to sit in it without running away. After that session, things didn't magically get better. There were still moments of tension, awkward silences, and times when I felt like we were barely holding on. But slowly, we started taking small steps forward. Our therapist suggested we set aside time each week to do something together, even if it was as simple as cooking a meal. It felt forced at first, but eventually, those moments became opportunities to reconnect in ways we hadn't in years. I remember the first time we laughed together after everything happened. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. One of the biggest hurdles was trust. Mark told me that he didn't know if he'd ever be able to trust me again, and I understood that. Rebuilding trust isn't about words, it's about actions, consistency, and time. I made it a point to be completely open with him. No more secrets, no more hidden messages. If he asked me a question, I answered honestly, even if it was uncomfortable. I knew that if we had any chance of moving forward, I had to prove I was worthy of his trust again. It wasn't easy for either of us. There were times when he doubted me, and I had to remind myself that rebuilding trust is a process, not something that happens overnight. But slowly, we started to rebuild that foundation, brick by brick. We weren't the same as we were before, and maybe we never would be. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. Rebuilding wasn't easy, but it was worth it. The road ahead was still uncertain, but we had a foundation to build on. The question now was whether we could sustain that progress and truly move forward together. One of the hardest parts of this journey was asking for forgiveness. Not because I didn't want it, but because I didn't feel like I deserved it. I knew what I had done to Mark, and I knew that forgiving me would mean asking him to carry the weight of my mistakes. I remember telling him, "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope one day you'll be able to." Saying those words out loud was harder than I expected because it meant acknowledging the full extent of the pain I'd caused. Hearing that hurt, but I understood. Forgiveness isn't a right, it's a gift. And I had to give him the time and space to decide if he could ever give me that gift. One of the things our therapist encouraged us to do was to focus on rediscovering each other, not as the people we were before, but as the people we were now. It wasn't about forgetting what happened, it was about finding a way to move forward together. We started talking about things we hadn't discussed in years, our fears, our goals, the little things that made us who we are. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were truly seeing each other again. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, of hurt. But those moments were balanced by moments of connection, of hope. Slowly, we started to rebuild not just our relationship, but our friendship. There were days when it felt like we were taking one step forward and two steps back. Mark would remember something I said or did, and the hurt would come rushing back. I had to remind myself that healing isn't linear. It's messy, and it takes time. That question haunted me because I knew he was right to ask it. I couldn't change the past, but I could show him through my actions that I was committed to our future. Every action, no matter how small, became a way to show him that I was serious about rebuilding our life together. It wasn't about grand gestures, it was about showing up every day and proving my commitment through the little things. There came a point where we had to ask ourselves the hard questions. Could we truly move forward? Was forgiveness possible? And if it was, what would that look like? For Mark, forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about letting go of the anger and pain so we could focus on what was ahead. For me, it was about learning to forgive myself, which was something I hadn't realized I needed to do. I had spent so much time beating myself up for my mistakes that I forgot the importance of learning from them. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't just about Mark forgiving me, it was about me forgiving myself so I could become the person I wanted to be. We weren't fully healed, and maybe we never would be. But for the first time, we had hope, a belief that even though we'd been through so much, there was still something worth fighting for. And that was enough to keep going. Rebuilding isn't just about healing the wounds of the past, it's about creating something new, something stronger. But to do that, we had to confront our deepest fears and learn to trust not only each other but ourselves. After months of therapy and reflection, Mark and I reached a turning point. It wasn't enough to heal from the past, we had to actively work toward building a future. That meant making real changes, both individually and as a couple. I said I wanted us to prioritize each other again, to make time for the small things that made us feel connected. Mark said he needed transparency, honesty, and consistency to rebuild his trust in me. Those conversations weren't easy, but they were necessary. Trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. It's something you have to earn, moment by moment, through your actions. For me, that meant being completely open and consistent, even when it felt uncomfortable. There were times when I could see the doubt in his eyes, and it hurt. But I reminded myself that his doubt wasn't about me in the present, it was about the pain I'd caused in the past. And I had to be patient with that process. Every time he trusted me again, even in small ways, it felt like a step forward. It wasn't easy for either of us, but those moments gave me hope that we could build something stronger together. After everything we'd been through, love didn't look the same anymore. It wasn't about grand gestures or romantic ideals, it was about showing up, even when it was hard. It was about choosing each other every day. We talked about how love changes over time, how it deepens and evolves. For us, it became less about perfection and more about persistence, being willing to work through the hard times together. I started noticing the little things again, the way Mark smiled when he was relaxed, the sound of his laugh when something genuinely amused him. Those moments reminded me of why I fell in love with him in the first place. We decided to focus on building something new, both literally and figuratively. Whether it was small projects around the house or making plans for the future, it gave us a sense of purpose and partnership. One of the most important things we did was start creating new memories together. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about showing each other that we could still have a future. There were still hard days when the past felt too heavy or when doubts crept in. But every time we chose to move forward, it felt like a victory. We weren't the same people we were before, and that was okay. What mattered was that we were still choosing each other. We couldn't go back to the people we were then, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was to build something new, something that honored our past while embracing the people we'd become. And for the first time in a long time, I believed we could do that. Our story doesn't end here. Healing is a lifelong process, one that requires constant attention and care. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the hardest journeys can lead to the most meaningful destinations. Looking back, I see how far we've come. It hasn't been easy, and it hasn't been perfect, but it's been worth it. Every conversation, every moment of vulnerability, every decision to stay has brought us to where we are now. I've learned that growth isn't about fixing what's broken, it's about building something stronger from the pieces. Mark and I aren't the same people we were before, and that's okay. We've learned to embrace the changes, to appreciate the journey for what it is. We've found a new rhythm, one that works for us. It's not about going back to the way things were, it's about moving forward, together. We make time for each other now, whether it's a weekly date night or just sitting down to talk about our day. The little things matter more now, the way we listen, the way we show appreciation, the way we make each other feel seen and heard. Those small gestures have become the foundation of our new normal. If I could go back and talk to the person I was before all of this, I'd tell her to speak up. To be honest about her feelings, to address the cracks before they became chasms. But I can't go back. All I can do is take those lessons and carry them forward. I've learned to value the hard conversations, to prioritize what truly matters, and to never take the people I love for granted. Those lessons have shaped not just my relationship with Mark, but who I am as a person. The future isn't guaranteed, but that's what makes it so precious. Mark and I don't know what lies ahead, but we know we'll face it together. That's what matters. We're still learning, still growing, still figuring things out. But that's the beauty of it, life is a journey, and so is love. It's not about being perfect, it's about showing up every day and choosing each other over and over again. If there's one thing I hope people take away from my story, it's this: mistakes don't define you. It's what you do after those mistakes that matters. Healing is possible, growth is possible, and love, real, lasting love, is worth fighting for. Life doesn't always go the way you plan, but sometimes that's where the most beautiful things can grow. Mark and I are proof that even when the road is rough, it's still worth walking. Together.